You're listening to the Backwards Hat CMO podcast with Dave Daba, presented by Stealth.ltd.
Welcome back to the Backwards Hat CMO pod. As always, I am Dave Daba coming to you live and on tape from the heart of the Silicon Valley. On today's show, I am super excited. We are going to be sitting down with Mitch, in this case, standing up, Mitch Duckler, the founder and managing partner of FullSurge, which is a brand and marketing strategy consultancy based in Chicago. Mitch is also the author of the upcoming book, The Future Ready Brand, a fantastic read when it comes out. I highly recommend it. Mitch, how are you doing today?
I'm doing well, Dave. Thank you. And thanks for having me on your show.
Yeah, super excited to have you on the show. Your book, I had a couple weeks to give it a read through, which anybody that knows me knows I'm not a big start a book at 10 a.m. and finish it at 10 p.m. It usually takes me a couple days or weeks sometimes to get through a book, but absolutely fantastic book. I would love for you to tell the audience about the book and provide some details around it.
Sure, I'd love to. Yeah, so the book is very much, as the name would suggest, about the future of marketing and brand building. And it's really based on what I've seen as the confluence of trends across three different areas. One is societal, a second is technological, and then the third is around active brand activation. So there's three chapters in each of those three sections, so 9 in total. And the three in societal are purpose and transparency, health and wellness, and Gen Z. And collectively, those are the factors in the societal bucket, if you will. Then the second is technological. And there I have a chapter on artificial intelligence, which includes machine learning, predictive analytics, and so forth. Also one on reality, so AR, VR, and the metaverse, and then Web3, which includes NFTs, tokenomics, and so forth. So collectively, that's the middle section, right? The technological forces. And then the third is activation, which is basically how those previous three chapters, those technologies are impacting brand activation, and in particular three that I talk about: content marketing, gamification, and influencer marketing. So I talk about all those topics and in particular the technologies, but more importantly on how they're impacting brand building.
Yeah,
I should also mention I interviewed over 40 CMOs. Most of them are Fortune 500 CMOs. So it's not so much my opinions necessarily, but what I learned in my conversations with them.
I would love to ask you off record how many of them were right, but I won't do that. Also, I noticed you had a great quote in the book from one of my all-time favorite people. Actually, I kind of consider Guy Kawasaki my PowerPoint hero, who's famous for saying, you have to use at least a 36 size font in a PowerPoint, and you should only have 1 point per slide, which has been completely thrown out by most companies and people over the years. But you've got a great quote from Guy about the book. Any additional thoughts on Guy and any of the other people you ended up speaking with?
I met Guy a couple of times. I've spoken with him at conferences that we both have keynoted, and actually came across him again. I interviewed the CMO from Canva, which is the company he's closely associated with, Chief Evangelist, I believe. And in talking with him, Guy came up and I said, "Hey, would you mind putting me in touch with them?" And he did, and we had a couple conversations, and he agreed to write the foreword for the book. But he's a fascinating individual, great speaker. I just got an email from him. He's coming out with his 16th book. It's just crazy.
uh, this is if I'm correct, your second book is
Correct.
that right? Okay. So you're only 14 behind,
I'm only
guy.
14
Plenty of
behind.
time for you to absolutely catch up. So we've got a couple topics that I definitely wanted to cover with you. I think, one of those first topics I'd love to talk to you about is the top 3 challenges brand marketers face with AI and how CMOs can migrate or mitigate, I should say, those actual risks.
Yeah. So actually, there's a number of challenges and obstacles that I talk about in that AI chapter. And it's a little deceiving because I want to say up front before we even go into what some of the obstacles are that the pros and the opportunities and the pluses, if you will, far outweigh the drawbacks. So I just don't want this question or my response to overshadow all of the great potential and opportunities that I see in AI. But yeah, there are a few that came up in both my research as well as some of my CMO interviews. The first is around, and I think this is kind of intuitive to your listeners, but it is the notion that there's really nothing new in the thinking around AI, right? It's based on the collective knowledge that is out there today in the world and specifically online. So as you might imagine, it is one of these garbage in, garbage out type things. And what AI is able to contribute to any marketer, whatever decision they're looking to make or enhance, is only as good as the data that underlies it. So one of the first things that come up is just data integrity. Are you confident with the data that's out there? Do you think it is representative? Does it have systemic biases even that underlie some of the algorithms? And I think we're all familiar with the notion, especially in generative AI, of hallucinations, right? When AI doesn't know what to say, instead of saying, I have no more, it'll make something up, right? And sometimes it's hard to tell, is this accurate or is it a hallucination? So I think that's one area that I would just say is what I call data integrity.
I'm just going to jump in super quick, just to tell you, I was on, of all places, I was on X yesterday, or Twitter, or whatever you want to call it. And I'm a huge Minnesota Viking fan, and one of the posts that came out was San Francisco 49ers Trey Lance to be traded to the Minnesota Vikings. Now, for those of you that don't know, Trey Lance was already traded to the Dallas Cowboys. It was an old picture of Trey Lance. It was a automated. It was basically AI gone wild.
Yeah.
And there was no human sort of over checking what this particular. And this was a Northern California newspaper that actually allowed this to go out. So it wasn't just some random thing.
Yeah. There's that. There's like what I was just talking about, like inaccuracies or biases, hallucinations. And then there's like even something where there's deep fakes, right?
Yeah.
Where people are actually trying to, with very bad intentions, recreate the truth, right? Or spread misinformation. They're both bad, right? And there's something just, to obviously to be aware of.
Yeah. Well, somehow, some way, AI is going to recreate the fact that at one point I was actually 6 foot tall.
Same here. So yeah, that's the first. I think another one that I talk about a lot, and I think is really important for the book, and the reason why I wrote the book is around brand fit and authenticity. I think especially as you start thinking about generative AI and the extent to which artificial intelligence can inform, if not actually create, your content marketing. How well can it really understand your brand and represent your brand voice, be consistent with your brand positioning and personality? And it can, certainly, right? And I think some of the better trained AI models do that, right? But it's not a given. And I think it's something that, especially if you're using something kind of off the shelf, like a chat GPT, that, marketers need to be very cautious about. Is something representative of their brand voice, or is it going to in fact dilute or even tarnish your valuable brand equity? So that's the second. And I think the third is just around maintaining human touch, right? The AI is very good when the data is good, right? When the data is accurate, it's very good with intelligence and rational thinking. But what it lacks, just because it can't possibly replicate it, is human touch, right? And emotion and creativity. And that's why I interviewed the CMO of Accenture, and I thought she put it perfectly. She said, AI is an amplifier of human talent. And I think that's the way you need to look at it, right? It's certainly not a replacement of it. And there are things that it can do much, much better than humans. And there are some things that can just never replace humans for. And I think that human touch, or that creativity and emotion are two of those.
Yeah. I actually saw her on CNBC the other day.
Jill Kramer?
Yeah, it was, you know what it was? It was actually some sort of ad that CNBC was actually running. One of these sort of paid for by Accenture things. But yeah, I mean, I think the world of AI is really interesting. I spend a lot of time working with companies that have seed money, Series A money, and I've worked with companies all the way through to their IPOs.
Sure.
But the majority of companies I work with are really in that seed and Series A stage. And the idea behind AI for those people in the C-suite is certainly exciting. But the reality of it requires human oversight. And I know, big brands are equally as aware as the sort of the younger next generation CEOs are as well.
Yeah, I agree 100%. I think, one of the things, and I will admit, most of the CMOs I've talked to were from larger, Fortune 500 type companies. But one of the things they pointed out is how much of a leveling of the playing field or democratization of marketing AI can represent. It's even at this point, it's at the point where it enables you to kind of play with the big boys and to a much greater extent, and to have sophistication and depth of insights that you might not otherwise have had without the capability. And I think it's a very similar dynamic. They drew parallels back to the internet, how the internet and the World Wide Web was a certain democratization of the marketplace, and AI is kind of taking that to the next level.
Yeah. One area, especially, CMOs at Fortune 500s, don't dig too deep into, because it's just in the weeds. But that is the whole SDR, BDR area of business. And especially if you are in a B2B technology business that, quite frankly, sells product in the old fashioned way, where a phone call is made or attempted to be made. And what I see a lot of today is AI, and I'm certainly not suggesting that BDRs and SDRs are going to go away, but companies are certainly going to be able to scale back on the size of those organizations, and utilize AI to automate certain components of the BDR SDR process. And that's where I also think, the smaller companies are going to be able to, quite frankly, compete and almost be on a level playing field with some of the bigger companies that they're competing against.
Yeah, I agree. It's certainly not going to replace them. I think it's another application of this notion of amplifying human talent. I don't see it replacing them. I see it, being utilized to make them better and more efficient and effective in what they do. And one of the examples, as you talk about SDRs, BDRs, that I think it already is impacting is in account-based marketing and the role that AI is playing in buyer intent, right? And picking up on buying signals and therefore increasing the integration between marketing and sales, right? And helping them focus more on, more immediate in-market opportunities, right? So it's not necessarily replacing those folks, but I think it's making them more effective at what they do if it's used right.
Yeah, absolutely. So the second topic for today, Mitch, Gen Z me versus Gen Z we. This is one of my favorite sort of sayings. Love to get your thoughts on that.
Yeah, and total transparency, that's not mine. That actually came from an interview that I had with the CMO from Coty, the
Nice.
cosmetic and personal care multi-billion-dollar company. But they've done quite a bit of research, as you can imagine. They're very focused on Gen Z. And in my conversation, my interview with him, he talked a lot about the duality, this dual nature of Gen Z, which makes them as complex as they are important in the market. But as the name would suggest, or the names, me and we, there is a certain, if you think about Gen Z me, what that is, that they're into things like escapism, self-empowerment. They tend to be more fashion-driven and style-conscious. Authenticity and transparency are very important to them. Individual and personalization, critically important to them. And Gen Z we, which I think actually is a smaller portion of the market, but gets a little bit more of the attention, is more about, they're the folks, or the side of Gen Z, if you will, that's very focused on meaning and purpose, diversity and inclusion, sustainability and ESG. They're very concerned about what's happening in the world and with the planet. And you really need to understand both of those. Sometimes they're the same person, and sometimes they're not, right? It's which is really kind of what makes it very tricky.
Well, when it is the same person, we call that a split personality.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean,
I think in particular, and because I've been asked that, just okay, so how do you market to that duality? And I think one of those points, like if one of the first things I talked about when I said me, folks, is authenticity and transparency. Right. And then when I talked about we, the first thing I said was meaning and purpose. I think there's a lot of overlap there, right? There's a lot of, commonality or connective tissue there that those two segments, if you will, share. But yeah, but some of those other things are polar opposite. And if you're right, if they are the same person, it's schizophrenia.
Yeah, I mean, that definitely can be tricky to target. And market to effectively, I think. The Gen Zs are. I hope a Gen Z would look at my outfit and think, okay, that's sort of cool, but I'm not entirely sure that they would. I know my wife doesn't like the backwards hat, but then again, the podcast is
it's your brand.
It's actually called that. So. So we have one more quick topic to get to today, and that is best practices for activating brand purpose to drive short-term marketing performance and build long-term brand equity. And the long-term brand equity piece is something I probably talk about 3 or 4 times a day with my clients.
Yes. And that is the key here. One of the things I do talk a lot about in the book is this, this importance of, everything, but including purpose, right? It's not just about what you're doing in the short term, right? And driving immediate financial or other business performance metrics, but also just building the equity in your brand. And you need to be able to do both. And ideally, you're identifying a purpose that can do both. One of the things I think you may recall from the chapter is the notion, and again, it's not mine, I think it's a fairly common concept out there, but this notion of the triple bottom line, right? It's not just profit, right? It's profit, people, and planet. And I think that's very consistent with this notion of purpose, is identifying a purpose that can really push at least one, if not two or all three of those components of the triple bottom line.
Yeah. I think the, long-term brand equity piece, yeah, by the way, that's very hard to explain to a startup CEO and or even a Series A or Series B CEO, because they don't necessarily have the money and or time to invest into that.
Absolutely.
But the thing I always tell them is it actually is, you are investing in your future, and you should be investing in that at the beginning, not at the end. You won't get to the end if you don't invest in that at the beginning.
100% agree.
Yeah.
Yeah. Do they, what's the response you get from them? Do they agree?
It's often a little bit of, and hopefully none of them are watching the video today, but it's often a little bit of a deer in the headlights look.
Yeah.
And it's just simply just not having not necessarily having experience bringing a brand to market.
Right. And one of the things I talk about in that chapter, and they're two separate, but they can be related topics, is there's kind of your corporate purpose and your brand positioning.
Yeah.
And the two are not necessarily aligned, and they don't have to be, right? You can have a purpose, but define your brand in a very different way. Right. But some of the best examples that I came across, and Accenture, we talked about earlier, was a great example of, they intentionally wanted to align three things: their corporate purpose, their business strategy, and then their corporate brand positioning. And they did so under a very powerful purpose. And listening to her talk about how they brought it all to life, and how those three big topics of purpose, business strategy, and positioning of your brand all work together, and how powerful it can be when it does.
Yeah. Which is a great thing. I saw a video on that. That was put out. One thing that I see a lot of is sort of also the not understanding of the importance of frequency. So it's one thing to actually get into a room and figure out what your overall purpose is and what your strategy is. But how do you bring that message to the public on a regular basis? And so this has gotten really elementary for me in some places, but a lot of times I'm like, okay, at minimum, your brand needs to be posting 10 social media posts on LinkedIn a week for your corporate channel, and your C-suite needs to also post 2 or 3 times a week, because the biggest influencers that most companies have in their company are actually in the C-suite. And there's always so much resistance to that, to those statements. But what it forces brands to do is actually really think about what their strategy is, what their message is, and what they're actually really trying to get across. It's been very interesting. I've been running this for about 12 months now, with various startups, and a lot of them are starting to see sort of the benefits of using frequency to help them stay focused with their strategy.
Yeah, I think frequency, I agree. Frequency is important, but I think equally important is consistency in that message. And I would take even a little bit less frequency if you're able to dial up the consistency in your message, right? If you have identified that purpose and you're able to reflect it in a meaningful way on a consistent basis, that goes a lot, as opposed to just being scattershot, right? You post 25 times a week, but it's all over the place. You kind of send a mixed signal. So I think both are important. I certainly agree that frequency is important, right? And no matter how consistent you are, no matter how well articulated your message is or your purpose is, if you're not out there talking about it, it's not going to take seat.
Yeah. Yeah. And just on the social media front, I like to call it the island of misfit toys. That's usually where a lot of people.
I like that.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of companies' social media channels seem to end up there. And if you go look at it, you'll see, oh man, it's been 3 months since an influencer at their company has posted anything on LinkedIn, or it's been 2 months since they've put out anything on LinkedIn through their corporate channels. And then you look back at it, and then you can tell when they had a social media manager and when they didn't. And
Yeah.
it's pretty. It's definitely pretty entertaining.
Yeah.
Well, listen. Any sort of final thoughts about your book? Anything else you'd like to tell the audience as we start to wrap up today's Backwards Hat CMO pod?
I think there are a couple of things I learned from writing that book that I would leave your audience with. The first is that all these trends that I talk about, this confluence of trends, have the ability to elevate the role of marketers within the organization, to elevate the function of marketing to be more strategic than it is today. And it already is in some companies, especially, consumer and packaged goods. They've always been very, very much driving corporate strategy and business strategy. But in a lot of cases, marketing is more of a tactical function. It's more about marcom than it is about strategy. And I think a lot of these technologies, especially like AI, have the ability or the opportunity to really elevate their stature and give them a seat at the strategy table, which to me is very exciting. And then the second thing I would say is that it's happening now, especially, the rate at which AI is catching hold is just stunning, right? The internet did not catch fire this quickly, right? In terms of the adoption rate, it's just amazing when you think about how new and recent ChatGPT is, for example. That's just one example. Marketers, and especially the world-class marketers, aren't sitting by waiting to see what happens. They are at least dabbling with a lot of these technologies and concepts, if not really fully embracing them.
Yeah. I think the really good marketers absolutely jumped on the ChatGPT revolution, almost day one. And they, also, I can say this from being in the software robotics process automation space, and hopefully you don't hear my dog barking in the background, but whenever I say that, he barks. He goes nuts. No, the mailman just showed up. But
Been there.
yeah. But in the software RPA space, in which I was a CMO of a startup for a couple years, we spent a lot of time actually integrating into people's systems and sort of being the highway between systems in major corporations. And a lot of what we ended up doing was working with ML and early AI technologies. And so, I sort of have been working in AI well before, ChatGPT ever came out, with respect to that. But and a lot of the really strong sort of marketing organizations, especially at some of the bigger companies that actually had, as I like to say, good relationships with their CTOs, were well ahead of the game.
Absolutely. That is so critical. And as you remind me of one of the quotes in the book, is like, look, you as a marketer, you don't need to become a data scientist, right? Don't let this overwhelm you. But you do need to master its application, and you do need to make kind of the CTO or the CIO your best friend, right? Because they can really be the key to your success.
Yeah. In the old days, we used to say, hey, as a marketer, make sure that VP of sales, today CRO is your best friend. And I've expanded that to CTO as well.
100%.
All right. Hey, Mitch, I really want to thank you so much for coming on the Backwards Hat CMO. Next time, I'm going to ask you to wear a hat backwards. I don't know if your PR team will allow that.
I will. If you give me the heads up, I'll do it.
All right.
I don't know if I'll look as good as you, but I'll try it.
I will take the compliment. Trust me. Anyways, listen, when does the book come out?
The book, it's available for pre-order now on Amazon, and it's available May 14th. So,
all right. So if you have a chance, check out Mitch's book, which is, as he mentioned, coming out in 2 months, The Future Ready Brand. Mitch, I want to thank you so much for joining me today on the Backwards Hat CMO pod. That is Mitch Duckler over there. I'm Dave DeBaugh, wishing you all a tremendous rest of your business day.
You've been listening to the Backwards Hat CMO podcast with Dave Daba, presented by Stealth.ltd.